Hello, everyone. We're thrilled to have so many of you joining us today. What promises to bring a really insightful session focusing on renewable sourcing. I'm Helena, one of Agendi's partners. I'm based out of our London office. Across the past 2 decades, I've had the privilege of advising many global organizations on climate, sustainability strategy, many years of engineering consultancy, working on design, planning, implementation of renewables, and these days focusing on decarbonization strategies and transition plan disclosures. I'm joined today by my fabulous colleague, Shannon. Shannon's a manager at Agendi, and she brings exceptional hands-on experience working with companies on renewable energy strategy, procurement options, and navigating the evolving renewable landscape and how that feeds into the compliance and voluntary framework landscape. Today's session is one that many of our clients and likely many of you who are joining are considering within your role, and that is how do you scale and source renewable energy in a way that balances cost, risk, and impact. Corporate action, commitment on decarbonization continues to grow. We have demands for transparency also increasing, and at times translating this ambition into action can be complex. And that's exactly what we intend to address within this webinar. A few quick notes before we begin. We are recording this session. We will share the slides, share the recording, so don't worry about capturing every single detail. And perhaps I'll move on to our goal. As I said, we've got around 45 minutes, and our aim of this webinar is to equip you with the knowledge to evaluate the renewable procurement landscape and ideally develop a strategic decarbonisation roadmap on how to get there and achieve that strategy. So putting this into practice, we'll be covering first a review of the broader renewable energy landscape, what's happening in the market, what this means for corporate buyers. We'll also explore different sourcing options, PPAs, virtual PPAs, on-site, EACs, or more commonly known as RECs, on-site green tariffs, and all of these come with associated considerations and quality factors. We'll also walk through how to build a strategic roadmap, one that is tailored to your organization's decarbonisation goals and your own specific operational context. And then finally, since EAC sourcing is one of the most prevalent and often the most suitable and flexible in the short term, we'll cover EACs in greater depth. We certainly encourage questions throughout. We have a Q&A box going, so drop any questions in the chat. We'll aim to address as many as we can or follow up with any responses. Lovely, so that's our overview. Let's get started and move ahead. We've got a ton to cover today, but I'll take a very quick flash step back and an introduction to Agendi. For those of you new to us, Agendi is a strategic climate and sustainability consulting firm. We work with multinational organizations across sectors, and we focus on strategy, target setting, quantification across all of those sustainability elements, and then transition planning, wrapping all of that up into terms of reporting and disclosure. Our approach is transparent, collaborative, and grounded in real-world application. And so our goal is to ensure that any sustainability strategy that we support to define is also actionable alongside meeting expectations across your stakeholders, whether that's internal, external, supply chain, investors, regulatory, etc. Brilliant. So let's dive into today's topic. So we're going to take some time to focus on the variety of procurement strategies, but first I want to take a step back and quickly refresh on the different types of technologies we're referring to when we say renewables. So renewable energy refers to sources that are naturally replenishing, i.e. they're not depleted when they're used. That said, they may not always be consistently available at any given place or time. Hence, they are flow limited. So I expect most will be familiar with most of these, so I won't go into detail, but we have solar, which is harvesting sunlight through PV panels or solar thermal systems. We have wind, where we're converting the wind's kinetic energy into electricity. Geothermal is tapping into heat stored beneath the surface. This can be to generate electricity or provide heating, cooling. And finally, biomass involves burning or converting of organic materials like wood, crop waste, even landfill gas into energy. And with each of these technologies, it brings a very different profile in terms of, well, we have up on the other slide here, advantages and disadvantages, and that translates into cost, risk, and impact, which is what is going to be our focus today. And one of the key points that we'll be weaving throughout this webinar is that there is no one single solution. The right mix of renewables will depend on your organization's goals, your risk appetite, and your geographic footprint. So we'll move on now, taking a step back on a global level. Around the world, governments are increasingly setting, potentially at times rolling back action, but we'll move on to the corporate response to that. But what we do have is an evolving landscape of ambitious renewable energy and net zero targets, and how these targets play out on the ground and the progress achieved, it varies significantly. So some of the factors that come into play are resource availability, policy maturity, infrastructure readiness, and this varies across each of the regions. North America still remains a leader in corporate PPAs, and Shannon will run through the variety of sourcing options. EMEA is largely policy-driven, but like most of the global landscape, there is a need for increased investment. And this was demonstrated in the last few weeks, where the UK announced that we're expected to fall short on our energy decarbonisation target. And then when we look out to the APAC region, there's high growth, high demand, and that's continuing to support the market. When we take this down to a company level, what does this mean for your organisation? And the first is that although we can expect natural decarbonisation of the grid to support your own decarbonisation roadmap, that progress is not necessarily guaranteed. Companies need to consider this evolving local context to also support and shape your strategy, and that will change over time. And as an organization, if you are committing to renewables, you are signaling demand for renewables, and this in turn is attracting investments. It's bringing projects online faster, especially in regions where we find that the policy support available is not enough to support that new renewable capacity. So I'm going to hand over to Shannon here, who's going to run through some of the broader context and then take a deep dive in terms of those sourcing options and considerations.
Thank you so much, Helena. So now that we're familiar with the types of renewable energy and the variability by region, let's take a little bit of a closer look at how renewable energy expansion enables global decarbonization opportunity. Renewable energy deployment plays a pivotal role in stabilizing the climate by reducing emissions that drive global temperature rise. And energy accounts for 75.7% of global emissions. Electrification enables a ton of cross-sectional decarbonization, which results in a ripple effect across buildings and transportation, manufacturing and construction. But electricity and heat alone contribute to an estimated 29.7% of all global emissions annually. And demand continues to grow year over year. With AI, everybody's favorite buzzword, the appetite for energy is increasing, and the IEA estimates that electricity consumption by data centers could triple in the next 5 years. So with increased emissions come greater climate hazards and the risk of environmental instability. The planetary boundaries framework is instrumental in evaluating the ecological integrity of the planet. And most recent assessments show that 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries have already been transgressed, with climate change noted as the most severe on the top left of the right-hand side of the chart. WRI projects the impacts of anticipated global temperature rise to have life or death consequences for billions of people. This could result in sea level rise, extreme weather events, changes in precipitation patterns, longer and more frequent heat waves, all which affect agricultural productivity, energy demand, human health, but critically economic stability for companies all around the world. Integrating renewable energy into an organizational sustainability strategy is really fundamental to long-term big business resilience, but also the science is telling us that we should act now and really not wait. So where does renewable energy stand today as compared to fossil fuels, and what are the key enablers to decarbonize the electricity sector? Let's touch on this for a moment. Renewable energy as a whole is poised to overtake conventional generation sources, in part to global policy drivers, but also with technology advancements, rapidly dropping the cost and increasing the efficiency. So looking back at the last 10 years, renewable energy has expanded from 24% to 33% of the global electricity generation mix. But this year, it's anticipated that renewables plus nuclear will collectively surpass coal-fired generation, and coal will decline below 33% for the first time in the last 100 years. Looking forward to 2030, renewable energy share in the electricity sector is forecasted to expand from 30% to 46% in 2030, and solar and wind make up almost entirety of this growth. But still, despite this ramp up, which is great, renewable generation is falling short of net zero by 2050 scenario targets. So if we get nerdy for a moment, there are 6 key enablers that will affect deployment and expansion that are worth highlighting here. 3 in the blue on top are within reach for corporate professionals to prioritize in their own sustainability strategy. The first is energy efficiency and demand reduction. This leads the pack. The cleanest energy is the energy we don't use. So understanding consumption and reducing demand directly correlates to the scale and cost of infrastructure that will be needed for a clean energy transition. But financing and market-driven deployment is also key. Many renewable projects are capital intensive, so unlocking public and private financing is critical, especially in emerging markets. Market-based instruments and corporate purchasing agreements de-risk projects and provide scale for renewables, and this drives the market signal for demand. The IEA estimates that market-driven deployment is expected to account for about 15% of global utility-scale renewable capacity growth. And of this, corporate PPAs and energy attribute certificates, or RECs, are making up about 40% of that market-driven deployment each. And that's pretty substantial. The third element here is robust policy development. So government policies, tax credits, renewable energy incentives, mandates, or carbon pricing, these directly shape markets, incentivize investment, and accelerate deployment. The IEA estimates in North America, Europe, and Asia, most renewable capacity growth between 2024 and 2030 will still be policy-based. So engaging in policy discussions and industry groups can help elevate the market demand for your industry. The last 3 are critical. Modernized and flexible grids. This is investments in transmission infrastructure, digitalization, demand response, interconnection. All of this enables higher renewable energy penetration and improves reliability. Technology advancements are also important. Improvements in the efficiency improve output for the same cost. So design improvements affect capital expenses, reliability improvements affect operating expenses, and all of these lower the levelized cost of electricity for generation, making it cheaper to buy solar than to buy coal. And in business, the money makes the decisions for you, so that helps. And lastly, the enabler that is often referred to is scalable energy storage solutions, which solve the intermittency problem with renewable energy. And what this really means is batteries and long duration energy storage, which allow for the time shifting of renewable generation when the wind is slowed down and the sun has gone down. A stable and modern electricity grid is the backbone of a successful energy transition, and battery storage plays a big part in that. Now that we've set the stage for why renewable energy is critical, and we've reviewed the levers available to decarbonize the electricity sector, let's go into comparing some of the corporate sourcing options and their impacts. So while it certainly helps to deeply care about the planet, as we all do, nothing accelerates adoption like a strong business case, and renewable energy has that too. Investing in renewable energy is a financially strategic move to stabilize costs, reduce regulatory risk, and meet market expectations in an evolving world. So those are the three elements that really drive the return on investment for renewable energy procurement. And to touch on a few of those benefits, investments in an on-site or a direct power purchase agreement or a virtual PPA can lock in energy prices and reduce exposure to energy price volatility. This can sometimes result in immediate cost savings depending on your terms. On-site and direct PPAs can improve operational resilience as well, resilience and efficiency in the case of severe weather, for example. Proactive transition to renewable energy also reduces exposure to future emissions regulations, carbon pricing, supply chain pressures, and aligning with climate risk frameworks, both regulated and voluntary, really reduces your exposure to compliance risk and enhances investor confidence. Demonstrating leadership in clean energy can also boost your market positioning, including ratings and rankings that influence capital access and brand reputation. It can support growing expectations from suppliers and downstream partners that may be requesting of you to comply with their targets, but can also manifest in fairly substantial reputational effects like premium pricing power, talent retention, internal engagement, each which have their own individual quantifiable financial impacts. So hopefully by now we're aligned on the value of prioritizing a plan for your business and understanding sourcing options and defining a strategy that works for your organization. It can be complicated and it can be a challenge. So just like what Helena mentioned about regional variation, organizations will each have different needs and operational presence and energy scale needs. So 4 primary options I'm showing on this scale are what corporations interested in expanding their scope exist, and they differ by scale, commitment, and contractual mechanisms. So shown from the left to the right, these are kind of increasing in complexity to implement. First, we have unbundled energy attribute certificates, often called RECs in the US, and these are often the first step that are explored in a renewable energy strategy. An EAC represents ownership of renewable electricity with specific attributes that has been added to the grid. And EACs can be used to reduce market-based emissions unbundled or without direct electricity provided. These are definitely the most flexible option. They're fast, they're accessible, and they have a low commitment. They're also very trustworthy instruments. In fact, they're the foundation of renewable electricity claims and the mechanism to demonstrate ownership of renewable electricity for the subsequent options as well. When it comes to green tariffs or green pricing, green electricity products are agreements with your utility provider where they source the amount of EACs that correspond to your electricity consumption. And they usually require a multi-year commitment, depending on your contract. Though for green pricing, this can be a little bit shorter. And these are more common in the US, EU, and Australia. They're not available everywhere, but they are a potential option depending on where you're located. Offsite or virtual power purchase agreements are purely a financial contract agreement between a buyer and a developer. The buying company has no title to the electricity generated by the developer, and still sources electricity from the grid. So it does not have to be located on the same grid as the asset. They can be in totally different locations. These usually have a high minimum scale, but no maximum value. But they are a longer term length. So they require a 12 to 20-year contract, depending on the stipulations. And lastly, power purchase agreements are long-term contracts to buy electricity and certificates directly from a newly financed renewable energy project. This can be either on-site, where you're consuming the electricity directly, or near, which is called a direct power purchase agreement, which changes the terms slightly. Availability and scale will depend on your market and location, but these are definitely location specific and bundled. So commitment and term length are typically long. The lock-in is high, the initial investment is higher. On-site installations are generally limited to owned facilities and moderate consumption needs. And so when you pursue this option, you really need to have a closely forecasted and aligned energy profile. Comparing and contrasting these a little bit further, each option provides different emissions reduction capability, investments, and savings profiles, term commitments, as well as additionality. So in general, complexity and lock-in increases from left to right on this chart. And while all of these options reduce scope 2 market-based greenhouse gas emissions, only an on-site PPA where electricity is directly delivered to the buyer can reduce location-based emissions. Sometimes a critical barrier of entry, the first year investment and the year one costs are much more attainable for EACs and green tariffs. And while it's true that renewable energy can provide substantial return on investments, cost savings potential is highly dependent on the contractual terms for green tariffs, VPPAs, and PPAs. So deals can vary. Additionality, or the odds that a project would have been built without the funding support of the option, increases as well from left to right. So for unbundled EACs, this is typically limited, as they may not incentivize the construction of a new renewable energy project. However, EACs as a value stream does get incorporated into the project development cost of electricity projections. So depending on the financial modeling, it's limited, but minor value adder over the 20-year lifespan of a project. Targeting newer commissioning dates during procurement of EACs can emphasize demand and drive market signals per project expansion when you're focused on specific regions of procurement. But in general, offsite VPPAs or PPAs are really the driving element when it comes to additionality, if that's your priority. I'll pass it to Helena to walk through a little bit of the process flow for how you would go about addressing this process.
Brilliant. Thank you, Shannon. So what we have here on the slide is a very simplified decarbonization strategy built around 4 key iterative steps. And within Agendi, we support across all of these stages. But first, we have the quantifications of emissions and establishing a baseline to carry forward and refer back to in terms of your reduction goals. And then secondly, the targets themselves. And ideally, that's going to be science-based, although we certainly recognize that a science-based target is not necessarily feasible at this point in time for all organizations. Third, we then have defining your emissions reduction pathway. And then finally, as I mentioned, the iterative process of implementation and monitoring. Now, these processes combined rely on solid frameworks, standards, protocols, and within the quantification stage, what is needed is a complete greenhouse gas inventory covering your scopes 1, 2, and 3. And that also means collecting reliable data, identifying trends, and of course, aligning with global standards and frameworks. Now, as I said, we do have it shown here as a linear process, but in reality, these stages are more dynamic. Your decarbonization opportunities themselves will help to shape your target formulation. When you're setting those targets themselves, we certainly would advise to set a target without knowing how you're going to achieve that target. And what we also want to ensure is that you are aligning with a recognized framework that, of course, come with their own associated rules on quantification, achieving that target, instruments that can demonstrate reductions, disclosure requirements, etc. And then aligning with these frameworks, it's going to bring credibility, comparability, and overall consistent structure for progress tracking. And then when we focus more narrowly on steps 3 and 4, this is exactly where our renewable sourcing comes into play. And Shannon's going to go into the specifics of a case study of one particular progression of a renewable roadmap. And it's necessary to emphasize that alongside your target is always the need for that clearly defined transition plan. This is going to take your action, your ambition, I should say, towards action. And renewables are going to be just one lever within many for your decarbonization plan. And a full emission reductions pathway will include not only renewables, but also efficiency, technology changes, supplier engagement, behavioral change, a whole host of other solutions coming together. And then lastly, when we move on to implementation and monitoring, we do need to remain mindful of potential expected change. And if recent EU regulations is anything to go by, anything can happen at this point in time. But things can change quickly, costs can evolve. What was not possible 1 or 2 years ago may become possible over time. So what's really important is that you don't set your strategy and your roadmap without a mechanism to revisit, test those assumptions, review those external market dynamics and trends, and potentially adjust. And so once you've identified renewables as part of your decarbonization pathway, the next step is to determine the sourcing approach that aligns best with your organization's needs. And that definitely starts with asking the right questions. Now, the tricky part is there is no one single right answer for every type of organization. Your approach needs to reflect your organization's priorities, capabilities, constraints, your type of business, your energy profile. I could go on and on about all the different factors that go into a strategy. But what we have on this slide, we've set out 5 key questions to help guide your decision making, whether or not that brings you towards a more flexible instruments or short-term consideration like the use of unbundled EACs or bringing that together with the energy supply in a green tariff, or moving towards longer-term, more contractual agreements like PPAs, or whether they're virtual or physical, or potentially if you have the real estate and the site dynamics to support it, on-site renewables. So one of the first questions is to think about your electricity consumption profile. Are we talking high predictable demand, or do we have smaller dispersed consumption profile? If we have a larger centralized load, then that is likely to favor a PPA, whether virtual, physical, on-site, etc. And smaller distributed loads, they might be better suited to EACs or green tariffs. So you need a certain level of consumption to make a PPA or similar viable. The next question is thinking about your organization's longer-term commitment. Can your organization realistically commit to a 15 or 10 to 15-year agreement? Or is flexibility more important to your business right now? Then we have the priority of required impact, or sometimes referred to as additionality. Is your organization's focus on making measurable difference in new renewable capacity on the grid? In which case it may make sense to favor a direct investment to spur on that new renewable capacity. Next question is thinking about your preference for flexibility. Within any organization, there's going to be change upcoming, and that can be challenging if you're going to align a renewable strategy alongside. So thinking about your preference of that flexibility certainly makes sense. Many organizations may prioritize ease and agility over longer term potential contractual lock-in. And then finally, thinking about your company's tolerance for the complexity itself, but also any associated risk, which, as we move on, that is becoming more standardized. There's mitigation that can be put in place, etc., adaptation, although it still does exist. So is your organization comfortable navigating potential energy market volatility, or the whole process of legal reviews, multi-year organizations? And if you're prepared for that, then a PPA or similar may become more feasible. And if not, it may make sense to stick towards those shorter term, simpler instruments for now. And Shannon's going to go through a potential case study in just a moment. But the key takeaway here is that there is a spectrum of options, and we expect a diversified solution towards a renewable roadmap. And that potentially is very likely to change over time. And so I'll hand over to Shannon here, who will run through a case study as promised.
Excellent. Thank you, Helena. So talking through the questions on the prior slide is a great way to get a sense for what's likely feasible for your organization in a given time horizon. And when Agendi walks through this process with you, we have a defined process to identify possible and high return on investment opportunities that will set you up for success for a long-term strategy implementation. So the trade-offs that were discussed are exactly the considerations that are necessary in a comprehensive renewable energy roadmap. And the goal of your roadmap should be to maximize that investment for the commercial and operational viability of your operations, as well as supporting the transition of renewable energy. There are a few key elements that a successful roadmap will always have that kind of build on that four-step framework that Helena mentioned. Every org is a little bit different, but these are key that are across the board going to be critical for you to consider. So as mentioned, establishing a comprehensive baseline and science-based targets is going to set you up for success in identifying what the success looks like at the end of your process. Securing executive buy-in and fostering engagement across stakeholders is absolutely critical. If you're in a sustainability function, you know that cross-functional communication is a huge element of a successful sustainability strategy. And with renewable energy and the investments associated, that is also critical for your renewable energy strategy. Assessing the pathways through the questions mentioned are critical in tailoring a unique context to your organizational energy consumption profile, your specific demands, tolerance to risk, priorities on additionality, etc. And it might look a little bit different for one organization than another, even if they're located in the same places. Once you have those pathways identifying, achieving alignment on what the risk, cost, and value proposition is, particularly a long-term view of the cost associated across a longer time horizon, is important to get the full picture on anticipated value. And then leveraging a portfolio approach that ramps to the final goal over time is also a really beneficial way to diversify your portfolio as well as reduce your emissions in a variety of different ways, costs, and efficiencies. Lastly, monitoring, reporting, and striving for continuous improvement is always the name of the game. You got to keep monitoring and making sure you're driving improvement over time, pivoting when needed. The example roadmap shown on the screen shows a corporate renewable energy roadmap that walked you from year 1 to 5, 10, and 15. And you see that EACs are often the first step that are taken in renewable energy procurement, where existing in the markets of operation. Tariffs are also easy and lower cost barrier of entry to explore for your early roadmap methods. When you get into year 5, VPPAs, PPAs become more feasible because oftentimes the contractual negotiations for these can take months to years, depending on the scenarios. So exploring those early will enable you to implement them mid-time horizon and expand over time as you explore what the right solution for your organization is. Every organization is different. This is just a common example of what's often seen in longer-term strategies. To reiterate the stakeholder engagement element, it can be challenging to convince decision makers in your organization to pursue a new strategy. And there are plenty of reasons why you can provide a stakeholder great reasons for exploring this, depending on their concern and motivation. So if you have leadership teams that are really focused on inflation, increasing operation expenses, or reliability, emphasizing that long-term cost savings may be a way to provide reason and facts that would support the decision to transition to a renewable energy method. For leadership teams that are concerned about mitigating business risk or regulatory uncertainty, emphasizing the reduction in regulatory and transition risk of regulations that are already in existence or coming down the line can help provide that business case to individuals to support that for long-term risk reduction. And lastly, for leadership teams that are looking to improve reputation or differentiate in a very climate conscious market or product role, emphasizing that renewable energy investments enhance market position and stakeholder trust can really help move the needle there. So one of the things we highlighted was that EACs are often the first step explored in a strategy. So we did want to take a moment and explain EACs in a greater level of detail to help you understand and navigate what this process looks like. So Agendi has supported dozens of clients across sectors in EAC procurement since 2021, enabling really the retirement of more than 1,200,000 megawatt hours globally, like a lot of EACs run through our systems. And it's important to note that EACs are a trusted, verified contractual instrument to track all renewable energy grid additions. All EACs, though, are not the same. Quality, transparency differs, and there are also attributes that define and modify the price profile of an EAC you're interested in purchasing. The core attributes that are foundational to an EAC procurement is vintage, or the date the energy is generated onto the grid, location, either in the state, typically the country or the region, and then the certification scheme, which indicates like a quality adder. At a bare minimum, you want to strive at your best to align the consumption location and the market in which it's occurring in your organization with the EAC in alignment with the vintage of the time frame that it was consumed. There are optional attributes as well, which can provide added market demand and specificity, as well as market drivers. So technology type can be dictated, which would indicate if you specifically want wind, solar, or a specific type of energy source, depending on your region. Commissioning date, if you want a newer project, which would potentially drive higher impact project development demand, or scale are some other attributes that could be defined when procuring EACs. Working with a partner like Agendi can add value to organizations immediately by creating a procurement strategy that aligns with your custom client attributes and needs. We can create a solution that aligns with whatever frameworks you're focused on and current best practices. And we have access to very high quality third-party verified EACs, including Greenie, which is the leading standard for North American renewable energy procurement. So consolidating a concise documentation package is another thing that Agendi will do for our clients, and this really boosts the credibility and transparency of Scope 2 emissions claims. Sometimes it can be helpful to compare an EAC attribution to an analogy to help understand what the critical elements of definition of these attributes really represents. And wine is a comparison that I like to use when I'm explaining this. The vintage is corresponding to the date the energy is generated, and in wine, that compares to the date that the wine was bottled. When it comes to the purpose of the wine, energy attribute certificates align with the year consumed, where you might procure a wine bottle of a certain vintage to celebrate an occasion of importance. The location is an attribute that dictates energy attribute certificates, as well as for wine, also France, the location, Italian wine dictates the style and the flavor. Labels of quality, such as Greenie or a 100-point scale for wine, also provide consumers and buyers with an understanding of that price premium and quality. But also type and retirement also are helpful comparisons. Where they differ, and one critical element here is to touch on that EACs will really decrease in value over time. And so the vintage really correlates to the value. If it's more recent, it's a higher value. Agendi can purchase and retire EACs on behalf of clients in multiple registries and global tracking systems shown here. And different sustainability reporting frameworks and regulatory bodies have varying stances on validity and impact of using EACs from other countries, but we will make sure that we work with you to understand your consumption profile, give you the best prices for the countries of consumption, and give you the registry that's the closest that we can retire and provide documentation on your behalf. There's a 5-step process that Agendi uses to support procurement and communicate the value of EACs and their impact on a company's scope 2 emissions. Typically, this process is about 6 weeks long. It can be longer if you're procuring in advance with the intent to lock in pricing. But we work through this process with every client to ensure that their specific strategies and priorities are clear. We're working through and providing the best price available on the market, and that we're retiring and providing documentation when they need it for documentation and communication purposes. So wrapping up our webinar here, there are a couple key takeaways that we want to emphasize. First, renewable energy is absolutely central in stabilizing the climate that reduce emissions and drive global temperature rise. There's also no one-size-fits-all approach. Regional factors and resources are going to dictate that supply, grid readiness, policy, and financial financing opportunities. A phased and comprehensive roadmap really ensures scalable impact. So to maximize the return on investment, it's important to prioritize a clear emissions baseline, have specific targets, gain stakeholder buy-in, and have a phased portfolio approach. And lastly, EACs support a flexibility at a low cost and risk profile, and they also enable market-based emission reductions progress while developing longer-term higher additionality solutions in your portfolio. So for companies that are really focused on the bigger picture, which is, minimizing risk, maximizing value, providing future business stability and sustainability in a changing climate, renewable energy investments is good business. So thank you for your time, everyone. We hope this session has proven useful. I think we have a few minutes for Q&A.
Brilliant. Please do pop some Q&A in the box. We're more than happy to get to any offline if we don't get to them. But while we're taking a look at the Q&A box, Shannon, perhaps I'll throw you one of the very common questions that we get collectively from all of our clients where we're supporting on renewables, which is in relation to price volatility. And, one of the ones, what can we expect in that regard? Is it going to increase, decrease, especially if we, maybe bring it more locally to US green EACs?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very common question right now, particularly with the US administration changes happening. So EAC costs are influenced by a couple key things. Supply and demand is kind of the foundation of that. So with supply project developments that are being commissioned, the IRA in the last few years made great strides in expanding this. So supply is strong today. However, with some of the RPS, the Renewable Portfolio Standards being rolled back in the US, repeals that are proposed on clean energy tax incentives, it's likely that over the next few years, less projects will move forward and complete commissioning. So that influences supply in one element, but also with demand, policy and market-driven demand really influence this. So with less projects going through, it's probably likely that PPA prices will increase. So there are kind of two scenarios that I can see right now, whether the corporate demand for EACs remains stable or reduces. This likely will mean that the EAC price stability remains the same. If corporate demand for PPA shifts to shorter term solutions and less PPAs are being signed, but corporates are relying more on EACs to support their decarbonization goals, then it's potentially could result in inflated EAC demand short term and increase the price. The last several months have been very stable in the US, except for when large corporate RFPs influence that supply. Right now, I anticipate it to be fairly stable near term.
Brilliant. Thank you, Shannon. We've had one come in on the Q&A box, and we see this a lot in terms of these longer term contracts. And in particular, the question is, how is a long-term unbundled EAC contract different from a virtual PPA? Just unmute, Shannon.
Sorry about that. Both are unbundled in the sense that you're not receiving electricity directly to your project. VPPAs are longer-term financial contracts that lock in a rate. Sometimes this is floating, sometimes this is fixed for exchange, but oftentimes this is a price that's determined and rectified based on market pricing as it comes in and can provide a longer-term price stability for energy costs for corporations that are willing to make that longer term commitment. So for VPPAs, a corporation would still be receiving EACs to support their decarbonization goals. And because it would not necessarily be located in the same market, those EACs would in turn reduce their market-based emissions, not location-based. But the potential there is a cost reduction, particularly with potential rising fuel prices and political and policy instability.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Shannon. I think we're already over time. I just want to thank everyone for joining. As I said, we'll share the recording, distribute the slides, and if there's any questions we didn't get to, please get in touch. More than happy to support. Thank you for your time today.